You have to get a Vortex, you have to have a get, you have to have an aim, you have to have an ECU to tune this bike. I disagree. Well, isn't this awkward? Maybe it's better to say better late than never, but allow me to explain my shift. Now, if you've seen any of my videos with the CRF in which I mentioned the fact that it has a stock ECU or only a JD Jetting fuel controller, or that I never feel the need to get a Vortex, a get, an aim, anything like that, you might have misinterpreted and just assumed that I thought that aftermarket ECUs are completely unnecessary. You never need to replace the ECU. Rather, it's more that you don't necessarily need to replace the ECU. There's a lot of factors that come into play here. I've said this a couple of times, but I will reiterate, the need for an aftermarket ECU is entirely dependent on you, your riding style, and honestly, how much money you're willing to chuck at the bike. And for my riding style, I ride on the street with supermoto tires, and so I don't necessarily have the need for something that gives me more fuel delivery at lower speeds so that I don't stall out. But there's also a second item at play here. I'm cheap. I want to get the biggest bang for my buck, being as effective as possible while staying in budget. And now with the 450 having been out for over 5 years now, we're starting to see new offerings of the latest and greatest. The Get SX1 is now the new hot commodity, so the OG yellow boxes can be gotten at a hefty discount. So now that I can satisfy my urge to scrape up the sloppy seconds, we can finally see what the fuss is all about, and also to decode a little bit of the mystery in this little yellow box. So let's take a few things off of the bike and start chucking it in there. I say mysteries because one of the caveats of getting a Vortex used is that I don't know what's on it. I don't know what firmware, I don't know if it's been tuned, I don't know anything. What are you, a 10? Yep, you're always a 10 in my book, bike. Because Vortex has been around for so long, they've had a lot of changes, a lot of adaptations and tweaks to the software. Not just the software, but some of the features that they use. So one of the first things that they did was tweak it to include traction control. So I don't even know if the one that I have has traction control, but we'll figure that out soon. More importantly are the maps that are on this. When this first came out, it was just a series of different maps for either an FMF pipe or a Yoshimura pipe and nothing else. But they have made some changes to that, and then in a firmware update, they actually made a stock map, which is ideal for me because this bike is basically stock. It does have the 450X exhaust, but I can trim that with some of the high, mid, and low settings right here and just add a little bit more fuel if I need to. I've tried to look online to see if there's an easy way to actually see what kind of firmware I have on this, whether or not it's been updated or if it's the OG, anything like that, but I can't find anything. So I can at least do one thing and just plug this thing in, turn it on, and see whether or not I have traction control. I think that would be a good start. So before I get really far into this install, I just want to simply unplug this, it's in there. There we go. Unplug this and then plug in the Vortex, and we'll do a quick test with the dashboard. Turn it on and we'll see if this has traction control. All right, so it fires up okay. So the way to test to see whether or not you have traction control is just to tap the starter, and then the check engine light should blink really fast every second or so. So let's do that, see what happens. All right, it has traction control. Now if I tap it again, now it goes away. So we determined that the box has at least traction control, but that was a really early update sometime back in 2019. Adding the standard map on this was done sometime shortly after in 2020, so it's entirely possible that that was on this as well, but you never know when it comes to used products like that. So I decided to go out and search with the usual tuning companies, the usual retail companies that sell this, to just reach out and say, hey, I have no idea what's on this. Can you please help me out? Can you update it to the latest firmware? And I won't go naming names because a lot of them came back and said, sure, we'll take care of it. That'll be $300, please. Really? With $300, I would be basically doubling what I spent on this, and at that point, I might as well have just bought brand new from Vortex. But I finally came across one that was fairly local to me and reached out, explained the whole situation, even showed that I'm pretty sure I didn't buy from them, but they said, no problem, send it over, we'll get it done. Price? 0. And that company that was so kind as to update this free of charge was Tokyo Mods. So Tokyo Mods, huge shout out. Next time I need anything ECU related, I'm definitely coming to you first. I'm also happy to have the latest updates because they provided this sheet here with revision records. And as you can see, there were several updates in the last couple years for firmware and base configuration updates. So now this box is all the way up to 2023. Now that we finally know what's on it, we need to get that in the bike. So one of the other caveats with buying a used Vortex, at least in my case, was that the used Vortex that I purchased did not come with a bracket. Kind of weird, but okay. So I'm using the old rubber and the old bracket, and I had to modify both of these. As you can see, this one kind of has the rubber on it, and I had to make cuts right here to allow for these two ports to clear, and I had to modify the bracket in the exact same fashion. As you can see right here, just cut off this little piece of the square. So it's gonna look like this, a little goofy, and there's definitely some space right here, but no big deal, it'll stay exactly where it's supposed to. The other annoying thing is the adjustment settings are right here actually, and so I can't just adjust them on the fly. I'm gonna have to actually pull everything apart. So I'm hoping it's more set it and forget it. And for reference, before I closed everything up, this is the setup that I'm going with. The stock map is number 5 with the update, so I have 5s across the board. All right, here we go. First ride with the Vortex. I also went ahead and reset the TPS as seen online. Fires up pretty nicely. Let's see how it performs. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's first compare the current setup. Previously, I actually tested all the modifications that I've done to this bike over the years in lieu of an ECU swap. So now we get the opportunity to test how close it is to the real thing. And in that comparison, I set up a test loop to get an overall feel for the bike's characteristics in any circumstance. We had everything from fast straights, slow maneuvering, tight twisties, and start stops. I'll be curious to see what the Vortex handles up here in the tight twisties. Last time I tested everything, this is where it was the deciding factor, more or less, for all of those mods. So this one, I'm hoping it'll really shine. Talk about impressive. Look, Ma, one hand. I don't think I would have been able to get away with that with just the JD jetting, so good job, Vortex. You did exactly what you're advertising. Well, with that kind of performance that you see in the slow speed hill climb, I have really high expectations for the twisties coming up. Oh yeah. That was a smooth roll on, baby. Still a little punchy. I mean, it's still a 450, but much more manageable. I feel like the engine braking is a lot less harsh. I'm not getting that jerk forward or that punch like I'm tapping the brakes. I don't know if the mic is going to pick it up, but I'm also noticing that there is a bit of a rattle in there. That's probably to do with just my adaptation of the OEM rubber and the OEM bracket. So because it's not 100% tight in there, there might be a little bit of vibration going on in there. I might just have to maybe add some more rubber, line it a little bit more, but we'll see. I don't think it's the end of the world. It's just really annoying on this first ride. Maybe we'll see how traction control works. I can't tell if it's cutting in or not. Might not be going fast enough. Let's try with it off. Oh, it was working. I got the tail end loose there. That's pretty cool.
Few inches later.
So it's been about, I don't know, 3 weeks or so, maybe even closer to a month with the Vortex, and feels pretty good. It's not just the throttle response too. I've also noticed a couple other small things, like particularly popping on decel when the bike is really cold. That's really changed. Even with the JD jetting, everything that I've done, it still has the tendency to pop on decel, especially when it's cold out like this. The bike's cold, so when I let off the throttle, pop, 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 pop. It's popcorn back there. All right, let's try this cold decel again. We're gonna let off. See, by now the old ECU would be pop, 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 pop. A little bit of burble when you get back on the acceleration, but that might just be that simply more fuel. The other thing I also wanted to keep an eye on was fuel mileage, because of course a lot of people have noted that the fuel mileage, the miles per gallon, dips when you add an ECU, which makes sense because the ECU is adding more fuel at different throttle positions. So of course, if you're using more fuel for the same type of riding, you're going to see a dip there. But comparing my gas mileage and fuel fill-ups, I've seen that it's actually not that much of a difference. Maybe a small dip
a little bit, like a mile per gallon ultimately, but it still fluctuates as much as it did previously. I don't really see a huge difference there. The other interesting thing that I've noticed with this ECU is that surprisingly, I don't feel it day to day when I just get on the bike and go. I don't think about it. And if you think about that, that's kind of what the point of this ECU is. It just makes it a bike that you can run. I don't really think, oh, a corner's coming up right here, I need to let off the throttle, but don't let off too hard because otherwise you're going to have severe engine braking, or make sure that the clutch is pulled in, otherwise you might stall, or this, that, and the other. I'm not thinking about that anymore. It's more like riding my Honda Grom in that ECU, because that one is a street bike. It's much more street oriented, so it's a little tamer when it comes to the throttle on, throttle off. You don't really think about that kind of stuff. And so with these bikes particularly, that's a little bit more on the mind, but less so now that I have a yellow box. So the other thing with this is quite an annoyance, but it's just a personal annoyance based on my setup right here, but the 12 o'clock labs mini gauge, as you can see, isn't. That's because, of course, when you order a 12 o'clock labs mini gauge, you have to indicate whether or not you have a stock ECU. I, of course, had a stock ECU for many years, and so that's what I ordered. And then now, with the Vortex plugged in, it doesn't know what to do, so it just kind of sits there. But we'll get that addressed very shortly. So, big question, is the Vortex worth it? Yes. Depends on the price though. All things considered, if there was no used options and it was still brand new only with a price of $799, I don't think it would be worth it for me. I would not be willing to chuck out $800 for that. But if I got it at 50% off, definitely worth it. That I would say even kind of qualifies as a bang for a buck. To each their own, but at least for me, I can say that now that we're getting a lot more of these secondhand in the market, I think that's a perfect opportunity for those of you that are maybe on the fence with this thing, so that you can get it at a hefty discount.